We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
From the moment Good Times lit up television screens in February of 1974, something powerful began to unfold in American culture. This wasn't just another sitcom designed to fill airtime. It was different, bold, raw, and deeply resonant. For the first time, mainstream television was showing a working-class black family not as stereotypes or background characters, but as the center of the story. The Evans family, living in a Chicago housing project, came alive each week. With warmth, humor, and love, and audiences everywhere responded. At the heart of it all was Jimmie Walker's unforgettable portrayal of James J.J. Evans, Jr. With his lanky frame, exaggerated body language, and electrifying energy, Walker didn't just play J.J., he was J.J. And his signature catchphrase, that explosive "Dynamite," shouted with wide-eyed joy, made him an instant household name. J.J. Evans quickly became more than a character. He became a cultural phenomenon, plastered on magazine covers, quoted on playgrounds, and etched into the memory of television history. But as the laughter rang through America's living rooms, a different story was unfolding behind the cameras. A story of conflict, competing visions, and quiet resentments. For decades, the whispers persisted about what really went on behind the scenes. The truth, as Jimmie Walker would later reveal, was far from the glossy picture fans believed. This isn't just a nostalgic stroll through a beloved sitcom. It's a candid exploration of how a groundbreaking show almost lost its soul, and how the battle over its direction changed television forever. When Good Times premiered, it didn't arrive with the fanfare of a blockbuster. It began humbly, a spin-off from Norman Lear's Maude, which itself had spun out of All in the Family. Few expected this little half-hour comedy to make waves, but Eric Monti and Mike Evans, who created the show, had something larger in mind. They envisioned a series that told real stories about black families struggling and surviving in a system that was often stacked against them. They wanted audiences to see the beauty, the dignity, and the pain of working-class black life in America. And with Norman Lear's backing, Good Times made its debut. Almost instantly it struck a nerve. Viewers were hooked, not just by the humor, but by the honesty. The cramped Chicago apartment where the Evans family lived wasn't glamorous, but it felt authentic. Florida Evans, played by Esther Rolle, radiated wisdom and resilience. James Evans Sr., portrayed by John Amos, embodied the stern but loving father figure, determined to hold his family together against impossible odds. Michael and Thelma, the younger children, gave voice to the aspirations of youth. And then there was J.J., the eldest son, an aspiring artist with an outsized personality, who would become the lightning rod for the show's meteoric rise. Jimmie Walker was unlike anyone else on television. He was tall, wiry, and endlessly expressive, with a comedic rhythm that seemed to explode off the screen. His catchphrase, "Dynamite," wasn't just a line. It became a phenomenon in itself, shouted by children across the country, repeated in classrooms, and even used in advertisements. JJ was the star America couldn't get enough of. Interviews, merchandise, magazine features. Suddenly, he was everywhere. But while the audience adored him, Walker himself began to feel a growing sense of unease. The laughs were real, yes, but so was the tension. Behind the curtain, things weren't nearly as joyful as they appeared on screen. The more JJ's fame grew, the more the show began to bend around him. Plots increasingly centered on his antics, shifting the focus away from the grounded family drama that had given Good Times its heart. To fans, the show looked like it was soaring. To those on set, it was starting to drift from its original purpose. Walker would later say plainly, "The audience loved JJ, but behind the camera, it was a whole different story." And the root of that story, Walker explained, lay in the writer's room. To millions watching at home, Good Times appeared to reflect real life. The tiny apartment, the struggles with rent, the dreams of something better. It felt authentic. But according to Walker, that authenticity was more illusion than reality. The truth was staggering. Not a single black writer was on staff. Week after week, scripts were being written entirely by white writers who, while talented in crafting jokes, had little direct knowledge of the communities they were depicting. This wasn't just a matter of oversight, Walker said. It was a structural flaw that bled into every aspect of the storytelling. Instead of capturing the layered, complex realities of black life in 1970s America, the scripts leaned into exaggerated humor, sitcom tropes, and simplified caricatures. The result was entertainment, yes, but often hollow entertainment. Walker would later describe the writing as a whitewashed interpretation of the black family experience. It wasn't malicious, he emphasized. It was ignorant. The writers simply didn't know what they didn't know. They guessed, they approximated. They wrote from the outside looking in. And the cost of that disconnect was authenticity. Scenes that could have been opportunities for raw truth instead became setups for punchlines. Jokes were abundant, but the soul of the show, the dignity of its characters, was slowly slipping away. And not everyone was willing to let that happen quietly. John Amos and Esther Roll, in particular, were fierce in their resistance. Both were classically trained actors with backgrounds in serious, socially conscious theater. From the beginning, they had been committed to ensuring that Good Times portrayed a black family with depth, complexity, and resilience. But as JJ's popularity skyrocketed and the scripts leaned further into his clownish antics, both Amos and Roll grew increasingly frustrated. They were not shy about voicing their concerns. Walker recalled how table reads would sometimes end with Amos or Roll walking out in anger, unwilling to endorse what they felt was a betrayal of the show's original mission. They wanted stories about survival, perseverance, and family. Not just JJ acting the fool for cheap laughs. To them, the show had started as an opportunity to shift cultural perceptions. Now, it felt like that opportunity was being squandered. The battles weren't just quiet disagreements. They were loud, tense, and often confrontational. Amos and Roll pushed the producers to bring in black writers who could write with authenticity. They fought to have scripts revised to reflect real struggles rather than exaggerated ones. But, as Walker recalled, 9 times out of 10, nothing changed. The jokes stayed, the caricatures persisted, and each ignored plea only deepened. The resentment on set, the actors weren't just reading lines, they were engaged in a constant tug-of-war over the soul of the show. The tension inevitably spilled into relationships among the cast. On screen, the Evans family radiated warmth, unity, and unshakable love. They were a model of resilience, a family that stuck together no matter how hard life became. But off-screen, Walker says, the atmosphere was very different. The chemistry that appeared so genuine under the studio lights often evaporated once filming ended. As JJ's role expanded and overshadowed other characters, bitterness brewed. Some cast members resented the shift, feeling sidelined or reduced. Walker himself, despite being at the center of the spotlight, often felt isolated. The laughter of millions didn't erase the frostiness he sometimes encountered on set. To audiences, Good Times was a celebration of family. But for those making it, the bonds weren't nearly as strong as they appeared. And yet, despite all the turmoil, the show endured, at least for a time. It remained a ratings success, beloved by audiences who saw themselves reflected on screen, even if imperfectly. For many viewers, it was the first time television acknowledged the realities of poverty and systemic inequality, even if filtered through the lens of sitcom comedy. But inside the studio, the fractures only deepened. John Amos's clashes with producers eventually led to his departure. Esther Roll, too, would leave, frustrated by what she saw as the hollowing out of the show's purpose. Their exits left gaping holes, both in the cast and in the heart of the series. The Evans family, once so strong and united, now seemed fractured on screen as well. The very foundation that had made Good Times groundbreaking was slipping away. Hindsight, Walker has been candid about the paradox of Good Times. On one hand, it was revolutionary, a show that dared to put a working-class black family at the center of primetime television. It broke barriers, opened doors, and left an indelible mark on popular culture. On the other hand, it was a show plagued by missed opportunities, by the absence of authentic voices in the writer's room, by backstage tensions that bled into the storytelling, by the clash between art and commerce. What the world saw was laughter, joy, and dinner meat. What the cast lived was frustration, conflict, and a constant fight for dignity. Jimmie Walker's reflections pull back the curtain on a truth many fans never suspected. Good Times wasn't just a sitcom. It was a battleground. A battleground between authenticity and caricature, between truth and entertainment, between unity and division. And while the show will always hold a cherished place in television history, Walker's revelations remind us that what we see on screen is rarely the full story. Behind every laugh track, there are real people, real struggles and real conflicts that shape the art we consume. For Good Times, those struggles were as defining as the catchphrases and the comedy. They were the unseen currents that nearly cost the show its soul. But the unraveling didn't stop there. When John Amos was fired from the show after constant clashes with producers, it wasn't just a casting decision. It was a devastating blow to the very heart of Good Times. Amos, who played James Evans Sr., had always insisted on realism. He wanted the father figure to be tough, principled, and grounded in truth. To him, the Evans family was not a joke. They were people fighting every day to survive, and he wanted that struggle honored. But Amos's outspokenness, his willingness to challenge scripts and fight with the show's leadership, made him a target. Eventually, producers decided they had had enough, and so James Evans Sr. was abruptly killed off. The decision shocked audiences. For many fans, James Evans had been the backbone of the family. Stern but loving, uncompromising but deeply devoted. His sudden death felt not just like a twist in the story, but like a betrayal of everything the show stood for. Off-screen, it devastated the cast. Esther Roll, in particular, was shaken. Without Amos, she felt the show had lost one of its pillars. The dynamic between Florida and James had anchored the series in a sense of reality, even when the scripts leaned into comedy. With James gone, that balance was gone too. Roll would later say that the show had started to feel hollow, and eventually her own frustrations would push her away as well. When Esther Roll left Good Times, it sent another shockwave through the series. Florida Evans had been the morale, compass, the rock, the voice of strength. Without her, the show struggled to maintain its identity. New characters were introduced, new plot lines explored, but something essential was missing. Audiences could feel it. The Evans family didn't feel like the Evans family anymore, and though Rolla eventually returned, the damage had already been done. The show that had once been a cultural milestone was now limping, trying to recapture the magic it had lost. For Jimmie Walker, all of this was bittersweet. His character, JJ, was still wildly popular. Audiences loved him, and the "Dinnomite" catchphrase continued to echo through popular culture. But popularity didn't heal the wounds backstage. If anything, JJ's oversized presence became a reminder of the very tensions that had driven his castmates away. Walker himself often felt caught in the middle, grateful for the success the role had brought him, but deeply aware of how divisive that success had been behind the scenes. He later admitted that it was a strange place to be in, adored by fans, yet often resented by those closest to him on set. As the seasons rolled on, Good Times began to lose the sharpness that had made it stand out in its early years. What had started as a bold experiment in social commentary was increasingly reduced to a string of punchlines. The gritty realism that Eric Monte and Mike Evans had envisioned at the beginning was buried under layers of sitcom antics. Even Walker noticed it, describing how the deeper themes of poverty, racial inequality, and survival had been replaced by safer, sillier humor. The show was still entertaining, but it was no longer groundbreaking. It was no longer dangerous. It had become, in many ways, exactly what Amos and Roll had feared it would, a hollowed-out version of itself. And yet, despite all its flaws, Good Times remained a trailblazer. For millions of viewers, especially Black audiences who had rarely seen themselves portrayed with complexity on television, the show was still important. It gave visibility where there had been absence. It opened doors for other shows that would follow, shows that would explore Black family life with more authenticity and creative control. But the irony, as Walker would later reflect, is that the show that opened those doors had itself been a battleground for authenticity from the very start. The story of Good Times is, in many ways, a story of missed opportunities. Imagine what it might have been if the writer's room had included voices who lived the realities they were trying to portray. Imagine if Amos and Roll's pleas for dignity had been consistently honored instead of dismissed. Imagine if the comedy and the truth could have existed side by side, instead of one overpowering the other. We might be talking today not just about JJ's catchphrases, but about a series that changed the way America thought about poverty, resilience, and race. Instead, we remember both, the laughter and the conflict, the triumph and the tragedy. For Jimmie Walker, the legacy of Good Times is complicated. On one hand, it made his career, catapulting him into stardom and etching his name into television history. On the other, it left him with scars, the memories of backstage battles, the coldness among castmates, the constant tug-of-war between entertainment and truth. In interviews, Walker has often struck a tone of both pride and regret. He is proud of what Good Times accomplished, proud of the way it resonated with audiences, proud of the cultural mark it left. But he is also clear-eyed about its shortcomings, unafraid to speak about the divisions, the compromises, and the way the show sometimes betrayed its own promise. And that honesty is perhaps the most important part of the story. Because Good Times wasn't just a sitcom, it was a mirror of American television, of its possibilities and its limits. It showed how far the industry was willing to go in opening doors, and how quickly it would slam those doors shut when authenticity clashed with commercial interests. It revealed the struggles of actors who wanted to tell the truth but were often silenced by producers chasing ratings. It highlighted the absence of diversity behind the camera, an absence that shaped what millions saw on screen. In that sense, the story of Good Times isn't just about one show. It's about an entire system. Looking back now, nearly 5 decades later, the contradictions of Good Times still echo. For fans, the show remains beloved, a time capsule of laughter and warmth. For scholars of television history, it stands as a case study in both progress and limitation. And for Jimmie Walker, it remains a defining chapter of his life, one filled with joy, conflict, and lessons that still resonate today. Dynamite may be the phrase that lives on, but behind it lies a story far more complicated, a story that reminds us that television magic is often built on very human struggles. In the end, Good Times was exactly what its title suggested, and also the complete opposite. It was joy and laughter, but also pain and division. It was groundbreaking, but also compromised. It was a show that mattered deeply, even as it faltered. And perhaps that's why it endures. Not just as entertainment, but as a reminder of the messy, complicated, very human process of making history on screen. Even with all the turbulence that rocked the set, the shadow of Good Times stretches long across television history. The series was a paradox, deeply flawed yet undeniably pioneering. Without it, the path for future Black-centered sitcoms might have looked very different. When you look at shows that followed, The Jeffersons, Family Matters, The Cosby Show, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, You can see faint echoes of what Good Times attempted. They all benefited from doors that the Evans family had helped crack open. The very idea that a black family could anchor a primetime sitcom, drawing in millions of viewers each week, was revolutionary in 1974. And even if Good Times stumbled, along the way, it proved there was an audience hungry for those stories. In the final analysis, Good Times remains a show of dual legacies. On one side, it is celebrated as groundbreaking television, a bold step toward inclusion and visibility. On the other, it stands as a cautionary tale of what happens when authentic voices are excluded from telling their own stories. That tension between celebration and caution is what makes its story endure, and maybe that's fitting, because real life is never simple, never just one thing. It is both triumph and struggle, joy and pain, love and conflict, just like the Evans, family, just like Good Times.